Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for covering climate in the Middle East and North Africa, presented by the Arab and Middle Eastern Journalists Association. And in case there's anyone on here that has not already joined up, we would love to have you at AMEJA. So definitely check us out on Twitter or Facebook or our website if you're interested in joining and getting on our listservs and learning more about events like this. We are thrilled to have you all here to discuss best practices in climate, energy, and environmental coverage in the region. In a region with an outsized risk of catastrophic climate impacts, especially ahead of the next two major UN COP summits set to take place in Egypt and the United Arab Emirates. My name is Jennifer Hijazi, and I'm an air pollution and climate reporter at Bloomberg Law's Environment Desk, and I will be moderating our talk today. Joining me are four top-notch journalists that we are very, very excited to have with us, who have made climate an integral part of their reporting, and we're here to discuss sourcing, framing, and coverage of regional climate issues in the Middle East and North Africa. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on introductions and then go right into a round robin sort of Q&A with the panelists. And I think we're going to try to pin everybody. Mahdis, does that look like it's working? If we pin all of the...
Everyone's pinned.
Okay, great. Let's see. And after the Q&A discussion, I am going to spend a little bit of time opening it up to questions from the audience. So if anyone has anything they're curious about, we would love to hear from you. You can leave your question if you're joining us via Zoom in the chat box below. Or if you're joining us on Facebook, you can tweet at me, DM me. I'm at Jen Hijaz on Twitter, JenHijaz. So if you have any questions, please let us know, and we'd love to add them toward the end of our discussion. Yeah, so now I'm going to take time to introduce all of our panelists who have incredible credentials that I wish I could read through in their entirety here. But for the sake of time, I'm going to encourage everyone to look up their full bios and Twitter handles that I've included in the Eventbrite page. So all of that information is in there. So please give them a follow as well at the end of our panel today. Let us start with Maya Gebeily. She focuses on the Middle East for the Thomson Reuters Foundation, where she writes about climate change, tech, socioeconomic inequalities, and other trends shaping the region. She was a reporter for Agence-France Presse, forgive me if that is not the correct French pronunciation, for 6 years, where she covered politics, conflict, and humanitarian issues in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Ghada El-Sharif is a multimedia journalist currently with the Toronto Star, with experience in the Middle East and Canada, covering politics, climate change, social issues, the economy, and the courts. Over the past 3 years in Lebanon, she covered the Beirut port explosion and its legal investigation, the October 2019 uprising, and the ongoing devastating economic collapse, among other stories, for Lebanese English language newspapers Lorient Today and the Daily Star. Farah Atiyat has worked at Al-Ghad daily newspaper since May 2004, covering the Ministry of Environment and Municipal Affairs. Before that, she covered other beats, such as the Ministry of Agriculture and Human Rights issues, and has worked as a correspondent for a number of Arabic TV channels, such as Kuwait TV and Oman TV. She's also a certified trainer in media issues. And finally, Anne Bernard is a veteran New York Times reporter and foreign correspondent, and is currently based in New York covering climate and the environment. Bernard led the coverage of the Syria war for the New York Times for 6 years, reporting from across the Middle East as Beirut bureau chief from 2012 to 2018. Since 9/11, she has chronicled the human and strategic impact of America's war policies on frontline areas from Iraq to Syria to Gaza. She has spent more than a decade based in the Middle East since 2003. And with that, I actually want to jump, before we go into questions, talk to our panelists a little bit about the previous climate reporting they've done, how they've incorporated climate into their beats, and some of the climate, environment, and energy stories that they've worked on in the past, just to kind of set the tone for the kind of work that these amazing journos are doing. So with that, I can start with anyone, if you want to take it away.
I'll start. In the order of the bios. So first of all, thank you so much for hosting us. It's really wonderful to have this conversation and to see everyone here and to have a little mini reunion with Rada and with Anne and others. So it's great to see everyone. And apologies for my background. My electricity will cut at some point, so I will be plunged into darkness. Please forgive me, but that's why I'm on my phone. I actually came, as Jenny said, I came from a background of covering politics, security, a little bit of econ for AFP for 6 years. And so when I joined the Thomson Reuters Foundation last year, covering climate was a very, very new subject for me. And so I'm excited to see how other reporters have learned to adapt to this, have learned about this new field of coverage and learned to find sources and learn to figure it out, because that's what I've been doing for the past year. The stories that I've gotten to work on in the past year have involved a range of things, features, one on Yemen and the way that climate change is impacting the production of its famous cedar honey, one on a look at how different research around the world fails to take into consideration the impacts on the global south of climate change, because there's a lack of peer-reviewed research in English coming out of our region and other global south regions. A look at how rising heat really brings to light the inequalities in who can afford to stay cool and who can't. So trying to definitely explore the different dimensions of the climate crisis, just from an economic perspective, from an agricultural perspective, from a research perspective. That's all been a learning experience for me. So it's been an uphill battle for sure, but I think it's one that I think will be very relevant to a lot of the other journalists that are here today.
Yeah, maybe I'll go next. Thank you also for hosting me today. It's my pleasure to be among these professional journalists as well, and who have the background in climate change. For me, actually, I started covering the environment issues since Jordan established the Ministry of Environment in 2006, actually. But especially I start maybe keen with reporting about climate change when I start working as a regional campaign and communication officer with the Climate Action Network. It's an international organization, but mainly I used to work with in the Arab region. I used to, trying with our members in the organization to do campaigns and to try to influence the public opinion and to raise their awareness about the climate change, and even to push on the governments in the Arab region to implement the right strategy and the policies around the climate change in adaptation and mitigation as well. So from here, maybe it's a start my experience to also report about what is happening in Jordan, how the impact of the climate change influencing different sectors in Jordan, especially in water resources and agriculture. Jordan is the second poorest country in water resources, so yeah, it's very difficult to raise and write about this actually many problem here in Jordan. And also I start maybe writing the news about what is happening on the high level, what is the government doing, what is the policies and the strategy for mitigation and adaptation, and then also trying to highlight what the impact on the people in the real life, on the farms, sector and others. So yeah, like Maya said, most of my also covering it's related to features and investigative reporters, and even I went to the COP I attend 3 COPs actually, 2010, 2017, and last year in Scotland as well. So for me, it was a new experience because I entered the negotiating in the Arabic groups, and it's very interesting to hear what is going on inside these negotiating, how they are trying to push on, the negotiating to their interest, and how the countries that they are impacted from climate change, such as our countries, Lebanon, Jordan, how they are dealing with these negotiating in the high level. So yeah, so this is how usually my works goes. Sometimes I went outside Jordan and covering the conference, and inside and trying to take what is happening on the high level and make it localized to the people so they can understand what is going on in the high level as well, in the international level as well. Yeah.
Thank you both so much.
I can go next. Hi, everyone. I'm Ghada. Thank you for having me today and for organizing a panel with such incredible reporters and women who've done amazing work in the region, and to talk about such an important topic that I think newsrooms are generally very behind on. So for me, I've done a lot of reporting on water issues in Lebanon, specifically looking at the failure of institutions and water governance in the country for the Daily Star. May it rest in peace. I also did a story on climate change, on how climate change was causing forest fires to reach record altitudes and burning cedar trees for the first time in history, also for the Daily Star. And then for Lorient today, I reported on the massive oil spill off the coast of Israel in February of 2021 that polluted over 180 kilometers of Lebanon's coastline with black sticky tar, which took authorities weeks to address, and and then just forced people to sort of mobilize and do their own cleanup efforts. And currently in Canada for the Toronto Star, I am covering COVID, but I'm also working on a couple of stories relating to how extreme weather patterns are impacting farmers and agriculture. And it's been really interesting looking at Canada because I think a lot of people just assume that everything works here. But I think with the climate crisis and even with COVID over the last couple of years, we're starting to see the cracks in the institutions and the infrastructure, especially when it comes to the most vulnerable communities, including, the indigenous communities in remote locations. So that's kind of what I'm doing right now.
Okay, is it my turn? Okay. Well, thank you again for having me on this fantastic panel. I'm really interested to learn from the others on this panel because my coverage of climate and the Middle East has been separate from each other. So the whole time I covered the Middle East, which spanned like 2 periods of about 5 or 6 years between 2003 and today. I only wrote one explicitly climate story that I can remember. One of the last stories I did from Lebanon, which was about how climate change was affecting the cedars, not only as an ecological treasure, but as a cultural treasure. It was part of a series about cultural treasures around the world being affected by climate change. And that was actually a really interesting example of the way climate coverage globally has been and was then evolving. So when we think about it, one of the biggest issues with climate is not only does it need to be covered very explicitly and urgently and with lots of resources by people who cover climate and environmental issues, but the real challenge is to integrate it into all coverage, right? It shouldn't be left out of weather stories, political stories, business stories. The climate factor should always be in there. It's quite analogous to the way race shouldn't only be covered by a reporter who covers race. It should factor into all stories, and same with gender or economics or other things. Or when you start doing, lots of news organizations decided to start doing video, and they would have like a video person, but then gradually you realize that all reporters should take video, this type of structural rethinking of how we do things. And that was underway during my time in Beirut from like 2012 to 2018. During that time, the New York Times established a climate desk and adopted a policy that we don't both sides climate, that the science is settled and we reflect that in how we talk about. We don't engage in sort of bad faith debates. So that was a huge shift, and I think some other organizations have been moving in that direction. And we do have a global climate reporter, Somini Sengupta, who's done some wonderful stuff, and a whole climate desk. And I cover climate, actually not on the climate desk, but on the Metro desk, because going back to my first point, climate is absolutely part of all stories, and it's a local story too. And in fact, in the United States, at least, a lot of meaningful climate action is actually happening on the state and municipal level because of the divisions in the country around it. So when I apply this to the Middle East, it's so interesting. When we think about so many of the classic Middle East stories that have been around for decades, that we never thought of as climate stories, but they were in some ways. The dwindling of the water, or the difficulty of sharing the water in the Euphrates or in the Nile, the desertification, migration, even war to some extent, which is a matter of debate that we can get to later. And how about not the elephant, the brontosaurus in the room, the oil and gas industry, all of these things. It would be interesting to turn the ship to see all of these things being integrated, having a climate perspective integrated to coverage of all these things. And I would say that even some of the things that I covered, if I did it again today, I would do it differently. For instance, the perennial debate about the perennial lack of electricity supply. It's not only, and water supply in Lebanon and other parts of Lebanon, it's not only an infrastructure and institutional failure, it's completely related to climate change. And some of the solutions might even help with climate change in the end. Even the You Stink movement, which was a precursor to the protests in Lebanon a couple of years ago, was at the time, it was a rare set of protests that were prompted by the piling up of garbage. And that's an environmental issue. But in fact, we also know that garbage and what we do with it is also a climate issue. And as I said, the whole oil business, everything that has to do with natural gas contracts. And finally, I just want to mention some stories that haven't come up yet in our discussion, but maybe we can talk about. I'd love to hear what you think, you who are still in the region, are thinking about the coverage of things like this, because I am starting to see people who aren't climate reporters, but they're Middle East reporters or other types of reporters. They are doing some stories from a climate perspective. And it's been very interesting to see that coverage of the marshes in Iraq, which again used to be sort of a the political use of the water and the droughts and things like this. Now there's a climate perspective on that. I wish I had the chance to cover this story. The people in Idlib, the last sort of rebel-held part of Syria, don't have any electricity. So guess what? They're doing community solar, just like people in Brooklyn and Queens are doing, So there's just a lot of really interesting things going on, and a lot of growing awareness globally that these stories can be integrated in really interesting ways.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for those amazing introductions. I'm really excited because it's hitting on all of the points that I wanted to talk about today. So before I get started, really quick, for anybody who joined a little bit after my introductions, before they were let into the room, housekeeping, please ask questions. We would love to hear from you. Enter them in the chat function below if you're on Zoom. If you're on Facebook, I believe you can either comment on the Facebook Live video, or you can tweet or DM me at Jen Hijaz. And we will get those added to the queue. Please feel free to add them whenever. So with that, I'm going to jump right into our discussion, starting with, and Anne kind of already touched on this. We've got a great segue into how we integrate climate change into regional coverage. And we, again, we hear a lot about, especially as climate environmental reporters, every climate is and should be a climate story, or every story is and should be a climate story. Do we see that enough in MENA coverage, and where are our opportunities to do better here? And Farah, you mentioned in a previous email to me that there, for instance, challenges for media professionals in the region. And Maya, I think you can talk a little bit about this too, who maybe lack adequate information. Maya, you mentioned adequate research coming from the Global South to actually do comprehensive and adequate reporting in this space. Can you both talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, actually, maybe because I've been covering.
You're accidentally on mute again, Farah, sorry.
Sorry, sorry for that. So yeah, I was saying actually, because I'm covering the environment issue for more than 10 years ago. And because, like I said, I was working with a as a communication officer, and I've been actually contacting the journalists in the MENA region, because we need to cover, we need them to cover our actually activities as a organization. Yeah, there's a lot of challenging actually faces that the journalists. First of all, the number of the expertise journalists in climate change are few in the MENA region. We see a lot of journalists, yes, covering the environment issue, but they didn't take it. It's not like a serious, but they didn't have maybe the chance to highlight their stories in a better way in the media outlet. Why? Because most of the editorial actually policies in the media outlet in the MENA region, they have their own priorities actually. And the first priority is for sure covering the political issue and the economy issue as well, you know, and especially in our countries like Jordan, Lebanon, because this is the main actually concern for the people here and there and everywhere actually. So most of the chief and editor, when I speak to them, they always telling me, okay, Farah, you know that the priorities for the people, they need to hear about the politics, what is happening, and especially after the Arab Spring, because most of the people, they started, you know, writing about the media outlet, writing about this issue and what's happening around and etc. But they forget that most of the climate change topics, like Anna said, that it's connected to the political as well. And it's connecting to the other sectors, like the economy sectors and the health sectors and the agriculture sectors. No one connecting that to other, you know, sectors. So this is the main issue. And don't forget that the journalists, they don't have actually there's a lack of information. The journalists, they cannot actually access to the information easily in our countries. Most of the ministries, they are trying to hide the information about what is happening on the ground, you know. And so the journalists, if they don't have their own resources, so it's very difficult to get what is happening in the high level, in the policies level, on the mitigation and adaptation program, and what is the impact really for climate change in our countries. Also, we don't have a lot of research. It's talking about our countries. Yes, there's a lot of research and studies in English in international level. But if you come to other countries, like for example, Jordan, we don't have. When I want to report about the real impact for climate change in the sectors, there is no actually research talking about that. There's no studies, there's no statistics actually showing what is the real impact for climate change in Jordan. And most of the journalists, if they want to access the information, most of the information in English. And sorry, but most of the journalists in the MENA region, they don't speak English very well. And it's hard for them to get the international reports, and they start to translate it and to get the information. So when I go to actually, and I attend the COPs and even the conferences outside, I don't see a lot of Arab journalists, to be honest. Because most of them, like I said, they don't speak English, and most of the materials there in these conferences and the language of these conferences is English. So it's very difficult to them to follow that. Also, don't forget that they're very disappointed, because when they try to produce like a story about climate change to their chief and editor, some of them, they refuse these stories, and they don't actually put it on a front page and the first page. They usually throw it in the inside pages, or it's not like it's a very important story for them. So, and most of them, if they want to do an investigative report, there's the lack of financial. Most of our actually media outlet, they don't support financially the journalists to go and do on the ground an investigative report, So this is a big problem as well. So this is why most of the journalists now, to be honest, they taking the journalism actually career. It's like a career. They need their salary in the end of the month, and that's it. They don't care about to do more efforts. They don't look for what is happening on the ground. What is the truth behind these press releases that it's come from the ministries, the environment of the ministry in the countries? They don't know exactly what is happening on the ground. And sometimes when I give a training for the new generation from the journalists, they really I don't feel that they really keen to be a specialized journalist in climate change. It's very difficult to try to explain to them what is the connecting between climate change and other sectors. And finally, as well, like I said, maybe the technical also, because the climate change, we know that it's technical information. Most of the people, they don't understand. And so how also it's very difficult to them to try to make it simple to the audience, so that we can actually raise awareness between the public, opinion. So it's a lot of things, but before, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, there were like a really specialized journalists in Jordan, they covering environment and climate change. But now, no. And even the pages that it was actually related to the environment, we used in Al Ghad daily newspaper to have a page in environment and climate change. But now, no, unfortunately. And also for me, it's very hard actually to convince my chief and editor, to convince him to actually publish my article about climate change. But there's a lot of opportunity there. Maybe with the new technology, it's easy now to do like a video, to use the social media. But it's need to encourage the journalists. They need to feel how it's very important, these topics. And even the chief and editor, I'm always saying that our chief and editor need a training about that. Trust me, they need a lot of education around the climate change and how it's very important to highlight this issue. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Farah. Maya, I know you're based in Beirut, as your electricity problems have tipped us off to. Do you want to talk a little bit about your experience in the region there?
Knocking on wood. I think Lebanon is a really powerful example, and I think Ghada will be able to touch on this as well, and Anne as well, and I'm sure many of the journalists that are watching us too. What we learned last year is we learned what it looks like when you have a completely unsustainable electricity sector, when you have an electricity sector that was built without sustainability in mind, just continuing to run on fossil fuels, when the country does have a wealth of possibilities to create sustainable energy sources. So I think Lebanon provides a powerful example unfortunately, because of the crisis that we're living, showing us how water, how all of these resources basically that are going to be further stressed by climate change are going to become increasingly rare for us, because the systems that we access them through have not been built sustainably. Whether that's going to be water, like Ghada spoke about, electricity. Obviously, we had a huge transportation crisis last year as well, because we didn't have fuel anymore in the gas stations, and everyone, there's no sustainable public transport system. So Lebanon provided a really powerful example last year of what it looks like when these systems are not built sustainably and you're going through an economic crisis. And I also just want to basically just +1 everything that Farah said, because she made so many valuable points that I think we can unpack further as well. But I think in one of the stories that I worked on last year, which was about the IPCC's latest report on climate projections, that pointed out that basically nowhere in the world is going to be spared the effects of climate change, whether it's a wealthy country, whether it's a It's a developing economy, whatever it's going to be, it's going to feel the effects of climate change, obviously at different levels, but it's going to have an impact. And the reason that this report was interesting to me, because as I was reading it and I was trying to see kind of what's going to be an interesting story for the Middle East, I just found that every example that they provided was from the global north. And they had a couple of sections where they were like, there's no data available from this region. There's a lack of information here. There's a lack of projection capability here, et cetera. And then later on in the report, they actually admitted, which I have the line here, that studies from developing countries are, I quote, often not peer-reviewed, not available in English, and mainly limited to the country level, thus making it difficult to compare the details of the climate information across them. So this IPCC report was looking at research, basically thousands of studies on climate change that had been done around the world, and they couldn't provide projections for the Middle East because they were not, the IPCC researchers themselves were not able to rely on the research that they had found coming out of the region. There wasn't enough, it wasn't peer-reviewed, et cetera. Now, when you dig in a little bit further to find out why that is, why there is a lack of research, it's because, as Farah pointed out, there's a lack of funding. So we're not just talking about a lack of funding for the journalists themselves. We're talking about a lack of scientific institutes, like you would see in a Western country that receives significant amount of government funding to be able to do research and understand how climate is going to impact our populations. We don't have that on a large scale across the Middle East like we see it in other countries. So we end up getting hit by floods and wondering, oh, that was weird, or we end up getting hit by heat waves and we're like, oh, that's strange. No, these are impacts that we should be expecting and that our governments should be expecting as well. And the best way for them to prepare these sustainability packages, and the best way to increase public awareness about these issues, is to have much more significant funding for such research across the board. You obviously have different countries with different funding capabilities, but another kind of, this ties into another point that Farah was making, which is the fact that a lot of our countries and our societies are undergoing crises that are seen as much more urgent. So, of course, in Lebanon, who in their right minds now is going to propose that the government dedicate funding to do climate research? In Iraq, they're not going to do the same. In Egypt, in Syria, whether it's a war-torn country or not, it's very, very difficult for us to make the case for these developing and sometimes struggling economies that much funding needs to be allocated to climate research. But I think that's really the core issue here. That's the essence. And once there's more information once there's more research that is available, it's going to spark more interest from journalists, which will then kind of broaden out to the public knowledge, et cetera. So I think that's a core issue that I was really surprised to learn about last year as well. At the same time, though, a lot of resources do exist. I was surprised to find such an enormous community of very engaged researchers, some of whom are from the region, some of whom have come from other parts of the world and are working in the region, who are working on climate issues. So at some point I was like, oh, maybe the media is the problem. Maybe we're just not looking hard enough. Maybe we're just missing the resources. I think we have to kind of, we have to make sure we allocate responsibility appropriately. Even, when I was reading a report last night, preparing nervously for this panel, and I came across a new council that I hadn't heard of before, which is the Mediterranean Experts on Climate Change Council. And I was like, oh, these guys exist. Okay, that's cool. So there are these little bodies that do exist and that we can try to seek out more. And one of the ideas that I came up with last night was like, maybe we just need to create a database of, maybe split up by language, split up by region, split up by climate effects, whether it's going to be heat or water, whatever, just to make sure that there's a resource for people to go to when they're writing about the region, so that we don't end up kind of cycling through the same reports, but that we end up lifting up the work of researchers who are in Basra, who were looking at water shortages there, or researchers in Kuwait who are looking at the impact of heat on migrant workers there. All of that stuff is out there, but they're often in academic journals that we've never heard of. And so it just takes us a little bit of effort to find that. So if we can kind of close that gap and make it easier for journalists to find those resources, I think it would do wonders for coverage all around.
Awesome, great. Did anyone else have anything they wanted to add to that question, Anne?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I had this thought come up as you both were talking, that feels very philosophical, but I think it's true, especially when Maya spoke of one of the perennial problems of Lebanon, which we often think of as a sort of societal problem, a legacy of the war or sectarianism, where like there isn't a common space, so there isn't public transportation. Okay, this is one of the central issues with Lebanon. Well, and that not only is a climate issue, but it of course has been impacting climate change forever because of and this is really true if you think about it in many of the Arab countries don't have adequate public transportation, even if they have some, and the kind of the types of cars that are used are not, we can say they're not really low emissions. And the traffic jams and everything, I mean, what I want to say is that climate change, it's often said in the US, is a stress test of all the systems. And it's a stress test of all the cultures and systems in the world. And in each place, it comes out differently, but I think climate change, the ways in which different countries and regions fuel climate change is related to their societal problems. Why are there petrostates in the first place? What are the consequences of being a petrostate, et cetera? And at the same time, the solutions to climate change, just as we say in the United States, can address certain root issues in society as well. So framing it this way, and as Farah said, like just all of these issues are political. How are they not political? Everything's political. The challenge we do have, though, and you mentioned the resources and the translations, but there's also sort of a colonial model that still exists in journalism, I think, where the big Western/international outlets are not maybe looking, as Maya said, in the right places always. And I even found this just on doing my Cedars story, that I actually could find local scientists that were obsessed with the Cedars, okay, at AUB and other universities. And you just had to look farther for them because you didn't necessarily find them on the first page of the Google search. You didn't necessarily find them in top journals, but because maybe they haven't had access to the same networks or whatever. And some of the stuff they talked to me about wasn't peer reviewed, but it was still valuable. And I think there are a lot of times more stuff that can be learned. And I'm not faulting the IPCC for not being able to manage this on top of everything else, but all of these like global and societal issues form a network of interrelated problems that also have interrelated solutions.
Yeah, I think just to follow up on that point, local coverage is dwindling, and which has major effects on the ways that people hear about climate change, right? And at times, like the only in-depth climate coverage available is covered by specialty or national or international publications, which can miss the opportunity to understand the nuances of the communities they're parachuting in and out of. And this is also true of foreign journalists, unfortunately, who don't speak the language or aren't from these communities. And you miss those details and sometimes those really important stories that would be really obvious to someone who is local. So hire local journalists and pay them well and train them because, they will know what the stories are that, someone who isn't from there, wouldn't necessarily turn to. And, I've worked for 2 local papers and I've often found that the best stories I've written have come from local experts. And we did do stories, quoting politicians and international conferences. And, but really it was talking to local academics, farmers, local scientists that really helped me understand issues on the ground. And I'm lucky enough to be a native Arabic speaker. So, from there, I'm able to sort of like find those stories that often go underreported. So, yeah, so I think it really is like just, making that point and like Anne said, sort of having a bigger discussion and a very serious and overdue discussion on the colonial structure of journalism as well. So.
Actually, if I could, you just reminded me of the last point I wanted to make, which is that climate is also a stress test of journalism. It's revealing all of our, issues within journalism, and it's a great laboratory in which to address those issues, not least because it's a matter of life and death for everybody. And just the other thing I forgot to say, the same idea that the problems that you're all describing is not unique to MENA, Middle East, North Africa journalism. It is a problem in all journalism. My editors too are great, but they don't know climate science. I don't know climate science. I'm new to this too. We all need to learn how to frame these stories, how to integrate them. We all are going through a crisis of local journalism and journalism resources, even in like the most advanced, parts of the world in journalism. So Farah, for instance, like at Al Ghad is probably one of the most independent, quality Arabic language newspapers that exists, and it doesn't have it solved, and frankly, the New York Times doesn't have it solved, so this is really an opportunity to work globally on this problem as journalists.
Awesome, great. And I'm going to go ahead and pin hire local journalists and pay them well as one of the top issues that we have discussed.
It's a climate issue.
Absolutely. So I'm actually, we have some great questions from the audience that I'm just going to jump right into here. I had other questions too, but I think a lot of them I wanted to ask next about sourcing and what you would advice you would give to new journalists or journalists already in this space reporting on climate in the region in terms of looking for sources and research to not perpetuate the same kind of stereotypes in DC think tanks and academics and things like that. And I'm going to tack on this question here about from Yada about if anyone's had any experience in which one is it? Oh yeah, difficulty accessing data and research in the region and how you tackle the problem in your stories. And do you have recommendations on institutes you go to or use comparisons from other countries that do have this research available? Sorry if I asked that weird, but if anyone wants to start with that.
I can just kind of lay out how I did it when I started, because I had a climate network of exactly 0 when I started this job. So questions to people that hired me, but it worked out in the end. What I ended up doing is I asked the editors of the climate page at the foundation if they had Twitter lists, databases, recommendations, whoever that they would think that I should be checking out just to read more on. And then, started to pile that into a Twitter list. Then I started to ask energy experts, because I found that there's a huge kind of body of energy experts in the region who have looked at things like oil, who have looked at fossil fuels kind of from a more commercial and from a more kind of corporate perspective. But kind of as a function of where the world is headed, they had to actually expand their their network as well to include climate watchers, and so they had a lot of recommendations as well. So I piled those into my Twitter list, and then I would just read a lot. I would sign up to random institutes. For example, the Atlantic Council has a great network. The Middle East Institute is setting up a climate program. The Arab Reform Initiative has a ton of climate coverage. So actually you start to find that different think tanks are now starting to shift into this kind of research and this kind of policy work. And so that's how I started to just build up Twitter lists. And then from there I would reach out to people, ask them if they'd recommend somebody else to talk to, and so on down the line. I find that to be one of the most fun parts of journalism is figuring out those networks and kind of expanding them as you go. But to this day, I still, again, stumble upon random things like this network that I stumbled upon randomly yesterday, or different academic journals that I'd never heard of, again, that you just kind of come across because you get linked from one academic journal to another, to another, to another. One thing that I would definitely recommend is a report that was published by the EU Institute for Security Studies in November. It's called Arab Climate Futures, and it has a really extensive list of resources in their footnotes, tons of studies, tons of references to institutes. It's full of data, of course, but it was just a really great way to expand the resources that I was looking at. And then definitely, and I think these are points that both Ghada and Anne were making, look at the local universities. They will have research that is very relevant to climate issues, even if they're not framing it as a climate issue. But they'll have data on maybe population movements. They'll have data on water levels in aquifers. They'll have data on issues that are going to be crucial to your reporting. You might just not have kind of come across it in a climate context. So those are always good places to start. And then, of course, I think what's great about this panel is that we now can see, you know, we can engage with other journalists who are covering the same thing and just ask other journalists who have done work on this stuff, whether they would have somebody to recommend or if they have any ideas on people to reach out to, and kind of you slowly build it out from there. But it definitely takes a lot of patience and a lot of time, but I think it's a worthwhile endeavor.
Great. And I actually have another question here from Bahira from the chat. And Farah, you might actually be able to talk on this pretty well, but because there are so few experts and solid research in the region, you know, a lot of the research that does exist is mostly from a government perspective, at least her experience, or at least that's their experience in Egypt. Have any of you worked on a story where you had to innovate to avoid the state PR angle? And how do you finesse sourcing in that case?
Okay, I didn't actually get the last one because I didn't hear you very well.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, it's in the chat box. Basically, they're asking if, you know, with a lot of the research coming from a government perspective, or, you know, the limited research coming from those kinds of perspectives,
yeah,
how do you rework that to avoid the very PR angle of a lot of the research and information that does come out?
Okay. Yeah. So usually when I actually cover the news that it's come from the high level, you know, from the government, from the different ministries, it's not only from the Ministry of Environment. Usually when I attend their activities like the workshops, the conferences, I don't actually rely on the press release, to be honest. I just listen to what it's happening, what's the information that it's being actually, I actually follow the discussion. And then I start, you know, building my own, in my imagination, what is exactly the information that I need, how my story it's going to look like. Usually I don't just take the press release and go out and just publish it, because this is the point of view of the government view. You know, they put in the press release what they want the people to hear, only the information that they provided. But sometimes I start you know, writing my questions. So okay, this is the information that they provide about mitigation and adaptation programs in Jordan. This is the truth? So I have to take the information and to try to figure out what is going on. Sometimes I call some of my resources inside the Ministry of Environment. Usually I don't use their names, you know that, because these resources, they help me. This is what it happens. This is really, this is the new strategy that, for example, they implementing, or there's something weird around it. Sometimes they provide me with a different information, but I have also to be sure that this information is right. So I go beyond that. Sometimes I go to the experts and I ask them. Sometimes I go to the ground and to do like a field visit to see what is going on the ground. Then I go with my own stories. Usually I don't write I don't write only cover only the like I said, the workshop and the conferences. No, I'm always doing my own story. Usually this is what I rely on, because the people, they don't care about the news sometimes. And don't forget, now with the new digital media and the social media, all these news, it's come to the public before you publish it on the newspaper. So no one will wait until we publish the print, you know, version, and then they're gonna read this kind of you know, a news. So for me, I have to do something different that it's gonna attract our readers, and to publish it in my newspaper, or no one will actually buy it in the end. So you have to do a new angle, you know.
And did anyone have anything to add? I'm going to like flash through these questions so I can get through as many because they're all so great. I'm so glad everyone is super engaged, but
yeah, I'll jump on just to point out an experience that I had with this as well. I mean, last year when there were the very, very severe water shortages across Iran, you could see the Iranian government was actually talking about climate change for the first time. And it was it's interesting to see them move in that direction. When I was talking to experts, they were saying, whoa, watch out, watch out. There's definitely a climate change role in this because there are droughts, but there's also severe mismanagement of the few water resources that are there. And so don't kind of follow the Iranian government line and just use climate as the only culprit in this, because they're trying just to point to water shortages and say, this is a drought issue, poor Iran, etc. There's actually a responsibility that you have to put on the authorities for taking water out of kind of the provinces around the edges, which are the agricultural provinces, and transferring it into urban centers. And that's another issue that has really, really strained water resources. So, so absolutely agreed that governments can sometimes put out misleading or at least incomplete pieces of information related to climate. You might see the opposite kind of with countries in the Gulf who are very keen to promote, you know, these new sustainable cities, these fully green initiatives, et cetera. And you do have to do a little bit of digging to make sure that's not the case. And that's why I think it's, you know, just as Farah said, use the skepticism that you have for everything else in your reporting and apply it here as well. Go talk to non-governmental sources, or talk to your sources in the ministries who are going to be a bit more kind of straightforward with you. Talk to climate experts, and then, you know, look at the watchdogs. So look at people like Greenpeace, look at other institutions who are really trying to hold governments and corporations to account, and just try to get their take on something. One story I worked on last year was about Oman rolling out this new technology to pull carbon out of the air, direct air capture, and turn the carbon dioxide from a gas into rock by injecting it into this rock that's present in Oman. And this sounds like the perfect solution, right? You just get to kind of suck carbon out of the air and then put it somewhere else permanently. It's pretty amazing. But what a lot of activists were saying is actually this kind of technology uses a lot of water. The plants that are going to be built may not end up being built sustainably. So it's really great to talk to activists who are looking at these things, because they'll make you think about the whole picture and not just kind of the straightforward press release that you're getting.
And just very briefly, because I do want you to be able to go to other questions, this kind of greenwashing or sort of pat use of the climate issue is not only on the part of governments, right? I mean, of course, companies are the biggest greenwashers, but I don't want to get into a long discussion of this here because it will just, it's like a rabbit hole, but like, you know, the whole framing of the Syria uprising as if it was just a climate issue, you know, has been really, you know, a mixed bag, because on the one hand, of course, we have to think about climate in everything. On the other hand, I find that you know, not only from like government perspectives, but really from, you know, from some parts of the international left or other kinds of, you know, people with a point of view, that is often used to downplay the political and other type of, you know, drivers of social unrest in Syria and elsewhere. So we just have to be careful. On the one hand, climate is part of everything. On the other hand, climate isn't everything. It's the interaction of all these things that's important.
Great. And I'm actually going to pose this next one also from Yara to Ghada about visuals and multimedia when it comes to being engaging but not alarmist in, you know, portraying these stories either in video journalism or photojournalism, what have you. So do you have any advice on sources for visuals on climate change in the region, or even otherwise?
Yeah, for sure. So if you haven't seen it already, I actually sent, and Anne also sent a link as well on visuals. You know, with climate change, it doesn't have to be alarmist. It doesn't have to be, you know, people dying and, you know, just destruction. You know, multimedia in climate change reporting could actually be an extremely useful tool. The link that I sent was actually a series from the Toronto Star in 2018 called Undeniable, where they went across several cities across the country and did these big investigative pieces on how climate change was impacting certain communities. There was one on Montreal in that series where the reporter actually, so there was a massive heat wave that one year where something like 70 or more people died because of that heat wave, and it covered, so he went and did this sort of self-test where he was put into a room that simulated the same conditions of that heat wave in Montreal, and sort of like, but he like took a video of himself doing this. He did a data chart of like, you know, what happens to his like vitals when, you know, the heat goes up by a certain point. You know, there's so many different interactive ways that you could show, you know, the impacts of climate change that isn't, you know, just a dying child in a desert. Yeah, and I thought that was a really good example of a creative way of doing it. So.
There we go. I'm also grabbing questions from Twitter here. We have one from Phil, which is actually something that I was going to ask in my questions too, about the pitfalls of stereotypes that are, you know, this coverage is rife with stereotypes, as we all know. Hyperfixation on conflict reporting, a very specific kind of conflict reporting. And I just kind of want to talk a little bit about, you know, how we avoid these same patterns, particularly in climate coverage, and tacking on to for Phil's question on how climate is covered in like a European, Canadian, US perspective versus how it's covered in the MENA region, and if there are differences there. And there certainly are, and you know, what's kind of nefarious about those differences and how can they be overcome? I don't know if anyone wanted to.
I was going to say that I think my fellow panelists are better equipped to answer that because they may be more familiar with the recent coverage by Middle Eastern sources, since I'm not covering the region anymore. However, and because of that, I want to add to the question, I think this was also in the chat, I'm very curious about how publics in the region are seeing climate compared to how they did like 4 or 5 years ago. You know, is it becoming incorporated into the many things that the dignity uprisings and other political movements are, interested in and incorporating into their critiques? And how about the general public? Is it even something that they think about for 2 seconds?
Yeah, definitely. And I'll go ahead and read that question there about, I think is one of the first questions. Let me find it from Azhar. So yeah, what is the public conversation and awareness about climate change in the countries that you cover?
I think there's certainly a range in Lebanon, and in Lebanon I found that there's a growing interest, I think, because we have journalists who are often English speaking and who are able to access a lot of the research that we were just talking about. And so they're kind of translating those elements into stories that are relevant for the context that we're living in now, in particular because of all those different crises that I was mentioning earlier, where people are suddenly, thinking about sustainability much more than they're thinking about, much more than they had in the past. We definitely see different levels of interest depending on what impacts are already being felt. I think that's very natural. So in Iraq or in Syria, where you've got kind of mass migration that is related to water shortages, that's a link that people are much more willing to make. All across the kind of the river basins in both countries, people will tell you kind of quite straightforwardly that they've noticed water rainfall and water kind of reaching down through the river just decrease year after year after year. And in the Gulf, you'll be, you'll hear much more often the question of rising heat and how people are trying to cope with the rising heat. Working hours are changing for people that work outside so that they can protect themselves against that. So you've got kind of different pockets in different areas. I think what's important is to figure out, like anything else, like any other story that we would cover, where it's a complex story, it's something that isn't immediately kind of catchy to an audience. We put in a lot of effort to make sure that we distill what the public interest is going to be in that story, and we put that first. We do that with everything, with politics, with the economy, with any other type of reporting, and we can do the same with this as well. So I think it really depends on the context, and of course on the language, as we've talked about a few different times. And then to address the question of making sure that we don't fall into the same tropes that we've seen kind of throughout the years in coverage of the region. I think I was talking to Ghada a bit about this before we got on the phone. I think it's really important to be realistic about what the region is going to go through that other regions won't go through. This is a region that is full of developing economies. Obviously, we have some of the world's biggest oil producers in the region, but they're not actually responsible for the emissions. These countries will, however, be hit really hard by a very dangerous mix of climate impacts. And you don't see that mix of climate impacts in a lot of other places around the world. So we're going to see flash floods, we're going to see rising heat, and we're going to see heat waves, desertification, lack of biodiversity. We're going to get all of those impacts. It's going to look different in different areas. And I think we just have to make sure that the way that we cover those impacts is relevant to the local populations. That's how we avoid those tropes. It's a local story. I mean, it's a global story and it's a local story. I think that's kind of climate all over the world.
And adding to Maya's point as well, that I think that reporting, I mean, it's not groundbreaking for me to say that reporting on the Middle East, I think often just assumes that this region is a pit of darkness and despair and chaos that kind of exists in its own silo. I think, in terms of like linking it to climate change and sort of changing sometimes the narrative of these stories, I can think of Maya, your story as an example on Yemeni honey, which I think at the time quite a few journalists linked the shortage to, or the issue there to war. But you linked it to climate change, which was, counterintuitive and an entirely different way of looking at a resource or sort of a crisis. And I thought that was really great and interesting. So it is possible. And, in Lebanon, specifically, a country that is reliant on fossil fuels for basic services, we're currently witnessing what happens when a society runs out of a resource that the world thinks is infinite. But beyond that, we don't really sometimes, I think, well, like we do, but like specifically with the Lebanon context, how these resources are exploited and hoarded by the elite and the political class, and how Lebanon is not an exception to that. And I think that climate reporting, we need to, in addition to looking at the impacts of climate change and the impacts on the most vulnerable communities, we need to really talk about what happens when our systems fail. Again, Lebanon is not an exception to that. And when people run out of resources they believe are infinite, just how quickly a society can collapse. And I think it would get people to really understand that this is just not just a Middle East issue, it's a global system.
Absolutely. Farah, you unmute yourself.
Just I need to add to that, to what Maya actually said. But we need to be aware about when, the Gulf countries, they said that their emission, it's not like the other countries, but this is the main issue that they are playing around it during the negotiating, especially because I attend the Arabic groups. They always try to say that it's not their fault, and the high rise of emission, it's not their fault. It's for the big economy countries like China and United States, and most of them, they are trying to look about their interests. They said that it's not our fault. We are not going to pay the same amount for the developing country who are facing the impact of climate change. It's need to be the responsible for these big economies. And this is affected the negotiating, by the way. And most of the countries that they are actually facing the big impact of a climate change, like, for example, Jordan and Lebanon and others, they always follow Saudi Arabia in the Arabic groups, and this is why most of their actually interest and most of their they lose always the chance to talk about themselves and what is affected, how they affected from climate change. And this is the big issue actually among the Arabic groups, because Egypt and Saudi Arabia, they are leading most of the time, and this is also a big issue. And don't forget that in the MENA region, there's the media, it's not, they don't have this much of space of freedom. In the Gulf countries, they cannot speak in a loud voice, and most of the media, they only publish what the government they give them. Other countries like Jordan, Lebanon, yeah, they have this space of freedom, so we can actually publish around what's happening on the ground and how our system is failure with the adaptation and climate change and etc. But for me, the foreign maybe media outlet, they know how to publish about the climate change, not because they have professional journalists and we don't have, but because most of their editorial actually policies, they give them the space to do like investigative reporter. They give them the time, they give them the older resources, and like I said, they have this kind of a space in their media outlets, so they can provide more stories about us than us actually in our region. And like I said, the priorities here is different. They have maybe our priorities, because it's political and this is why it's more highlighted in our newspaper. It's not like them, they can't publish anything about any stories actually. It's not like us. So we need to be aware that I have the space of freedom, but not all the time. Sometimes there's something hide in the editorial policy, and my chief editor sometimes call me, okay, we cannot publish on this, we cannot do report on that because the government will get angry and we don't want them to so it's totally different than we cannot actually compare, because it's gonna be sorry, but I think the comparing, it's not fair. It's not fair at all, because this is our actually editorial policies in the Arab region. We cannot change it all the time.
Great. Perfect. Thank you all so much. I'm going to ask just one really quick question here, just really quick round robin for everyone on steps that can be taken to improve coverage and how they hope to shift. I'm trying to read the question. Just any kind of final thoughts on, opportunities that can be taken in this space to do better, just to round up the conversation.
Why don't we go in reverse order, because I don't feel like I'm the one who should have the last word. I'll just say my small piece, which is that just to reiterate that I think, in addition to Maya's idea of a database, some kind of like global repository of ideas, sources, collaboration, support for journalists covering this, even in all different languages, would be so great. I mean, it's kind of idealistic, but I actually think those things do work in the long run and are important. So I like that idea very much. And I'll also reiterate the most local thing, which is that, all politics is local, all climate change is local, in addition to being global. So I think one area to drill down on are very local movements. I mean, the You Stink protest started with one town, so that I think the space for free speech is also larger the more local you get, I think, in the region. So those are my two thoughts.
Everything that Anne said and Maya said and Farah said, obviously, this has been an amazing panel. But I think maybe something we didn't touch on that we could think about as well is this idea of climate refugees. I think we often talk about refugees, especially in this region, as people fleeing war. But I think we could definitely focus more on how climate change is internally displacing people, which I think we're already seeing and is being reported on more, especially in the last year. But I think it will only become more of an issue, like the internal displacement of local populations. So yeah, that and creating a really solid database that we can use.
I'm going to start that Google spreadsheet now. I think you guys will get this like link shortly in the chat where we can start filling it in. No, I think it's a great initial list. I think that the main thing that I would really encourage institutions and any kind of funders, donors who are supporting journalism initiatives elsewhere is to fund technical trainings for journalists who speak Arabic, who speak Kurdish, who speak Farsi, who speak Turkish, who speak Berber, whatever language is being spoken in the region. There needs to be a significant level of technical trainings to make sure that journalists know what questions to ask, where to look for resources, and how to question narratives wherever those narratives are coming from. I'm lucky enough that as an English speaker, I can, if I don't understand something that I'm reading in a piece of research, there are 10,000 like climate 101 pages that I can go to, and I can basically get like a layman's terms explanation for what I'm looking at. And that doesn't necessarily exist in Arabic, as far as I know. So I think it's super, super important to try to get that started, and to make sure that big donors that donate to journalism initiatives, whether it's people like the Rockefeller Foundation or the Bill Gates Foundation, whoever it might be, is starting to really think about making sure that journalists are able to write about what's happening to their countries in their own languages. That's the main thing, and I just think more collaboration. I think what I've found in the past, less than a year working on these issues, is that there are a lot of people writing about similar things, but we're kind of siloed off from one another. And we're not sharing resources or ideas enough. And so I would love kind of more forums like this where we can talk more. And just, for us, for the journalists ourselves, I think, to really drive home the point that has been made multiple times in this conversation of like everything can be a climate story, like literally everything can be a climate story. It's about resources, it's about people, it's about needs, it's about societies. So whether it's, as Farah said, the very political story of the negotiations and of the commitments of different countries, whether it's about how societies are adapting, whether it's about new cities that are being built, there are literally kind of endless stories to write about this. And so I think, the more collaboration, the better that we can serve this story.
Yeah, actually, I agree with Ghada and also Maya. I think there were like an idea before, but actually it didn't success, that why there's no a network for the environmental journalists and the climate journalists who are actually in the MENA region. So this is like a way that they can actually cooperate with each other. If I need more information about Iraq or about Yemen or about any other countries, so my colleague will help me. They can give me the context, the expertise, and others. This is like there's like actually a network for the agriculture journalism who I'm part of it, because I'm covering the climate change. So they invite me to be a part of that. So this is a big network. Actually, they find a lot of expertise from around the world. They can speak with them. They can chat directly with them if they need more information. Sometimes they provide them with institutions and organization in their countries that they can provide them with a lot of information. Also, I think it's a good idea that if there's a regional offices for the international organization in your country, you can benefit from them. For example, we have the UNDP. They have a lot of resources around climate change in Arabic, for example, and about Jordan especially. So I contact them. I'm always trying to get from them a lot of information, as well as like GIZ and other organizations who really, they have a part from of their work, climate change, and specifically for their countries. I think Lebanon as well, they have a lot of regional offices. ISQA, for example, they have, they always actually produce a lot of reports in Arabic about what is happening around in the MENA region on climate change policies. And even, yeah, they don't have this, you know, specific on the public, but how it's the impact on the public, but at least they have a lot of information you can find there as well. So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity, and there's a lot of way we can actually benefit from what is happening, and the information and how we can report to our media outlet, and making our stories very very attractive to the public opinion as well, so we can raise their awareness as well.
Great. I honestly wish this conversation could go on for the rest of the day, because this has been so interesting and so informative, and I feel so blessed that you all have joined us to talk to these amazing panelists. And there already seems to be spread list or database plans forming. So let us absolutely. Sorry.
Look at what you've done, Maya.
Love it. We're here for it. So yes,
troublemaker, that's what's happening. No, but this is why these conversations really are just, they're so impactful, because they can really, you know, just get something started. So I really appreciate you guys for setting this up as well.
Yes, absolutely. Amazing. Okay, so it looks like the chat will be saved. There's already talk about where you can send database, spreadsheet suggestions to Maya. And this chat was also recorded for anyone who has any questions. So I'm going to post it everywhere too, and you can find this on the AMEJA website. And I'm going to plug AMEJA one more time. If you are interested in joining or even donating, please find us on our website, find us on Twitter, find us on Facebook. We would love to have you. If you have any suggestions for panels in the future, we would also love those. And with that, I'm going to let everyone get back to their Fridays. I'm sure everyone's really busy. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you, Mahdis, for coordinating all of our tech. And we hope to see you again for future AMEJA panels. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. I loved this. Thank you so much.